And then this issue of locality is not always easy. So you've probably been following the story of Google and how they went into China, how they decided in a global fashion to accept the local conditions, to accept the censorship from the government, hoping that the society would change. And then a few months ago, when it seemed like the accounts, the Gmail accounts of human rights activists were being hacked into, they gave the government an ultimatum and said, we will now stop the censorship, and if the government still wants to censor us, we will leave. So, of course, the government said, here's the door. So now they operate out of Hong Kong. And I've just come from there yesterday, in fact, and it's very frustrating being there and not having this access now to YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and so on. So these tensions, these issues of locality are not always easy ones. The last principle, then, I believe, is circularity. This is the simple concept of not using end-of-pipe solutions, not putting a filter on the smokestack in order to solve the problem, but actually redesigning the system. And one of the things I like about the cradle-to-cradle approach of McDonough and Braungart is that they're saying it's not only a natural cycle that we need to close. So this glass, for example, this can go back to nature. It's essentially made of sand, and that's part of a natural nutrient cycle. So we've got to keep that going around. But this piece of plastic here is not going to degrade very easily. And they argue that that's okay, so long as it goes back into the technical nutrient cycle, so as long as it goes back completely into the manufacturing process. So I think that's an important concept and starts to get to the heart of the reason why we're still failing on responsibility and sustainability, because it's not tackling our consumption and production lifestyle. This is just an example of shore carpets in the US, where they will take back your carpet once they've installed it and it starts to wear out. They'll take back the carpet, completely dismantle and recycle it, and replace it for you. And similarly, this camera has a similar approach. Of course, our mobile phones are one of the worst culprits here, and at least in the UK, the average life of a mobile phone is 9 months, after which people throw it away. Perfectly good mobile phone, but the next latest gadget upgrade has come along, and in fact the mobile phone companies will offer you that free upgrade. And so PhoneBack is an organization that started to do good work by closing that loop, and they've recycled over 18 million phones. And now it's a lot easier when you're upgrading your phone, if you have to put that back into the production cycle. Now, before I end off, I wanted to say a little bit about social media, because I think it is part of the solution. It's part of the way that the world is changing, and it's certainly part of the Web 2.0 world. But just to reiterate that for me, CSR 2.0 is not only about using technology applied to CSR. Well, what's interesting about this page, it's of Just Means, which is, if you like, a CSR social networking site, is they now have a section where you can follow companies. So you can decide that you're the company's stakeholder, you select to follow them, a little bit like Twitter, and to get whatever updates they send you, whether it's a CSR report or a media release. But then, of course, you can also give them the direct feedback, as critical as you like. And we've seen some companies like Timberland starting to use this in a fairly progressive manner, starting to issue quarterly reports on their CSR performance rather than annual or biannual. So it's starting to change. Now, it's a double-edged sword. I happened to be in Indonesia in Malaysia when the Nestle campaign by Greenpeace broke. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with it, but essentially Greenpeace was targeting Nestle through their KitKat product because they had an Indonesian supplier that was meant to be sourcing palm oil from a cleared rainforest, and as a result, the orangutan is going extinct. And they have a very shocking, high-impact video, just 60 seconds long. We might even show it in one of the social media workshops today, where, you know, the slogan, take a break, have a Kit Kat. Somebody's working in the office, they have a break, they bite into the chocolate, and it turns into the finger of an orangutan, and it goes crunch, and all the blood comes down the front of the person's shirt. Very sort of shocking, high impact, very typically Greenpeace. What's interesting about it from a social media perspective is that, according to some research, within 4 days, that video had been seen by 500,000 people, just through the social media sites like Facebook and Twitter. Not only that, but being a slightly progressive company, Nestle tried to then defend itself on Facebook, because they have an account there, saying, well, you know, they're not so bad after all, and in fact they are committed to sustainable palm oil, and they will convert all their palm oil to the RSPO certification by 2015. But in fact it was too late, and they got completely taken to pieces by the activists on Facebook. And one of the things that started happening is that the activists started to change their logos, their profile pictures, to a logo of Nestle that had been changed, or Kit Kat that had been changed to Killer. Now, of course, Nestle couldn't have it that they were having comments posted on their page on Facebook with all of these killer logos, so they started deleting the comments. And then, of course, they got accused of censoring the public comments. So it was really a very difficult time for them. And I think social media is still very tricky for companies to use for CSR. And certainly the time to use it is often not when you get into a crisis, but long before. So for me, I pulled this together in a model. Of course, it just shows that I've spent too long in consulting and academia that I have to come up with a double helix model. But essentially, I believe that there are 4 elements, or 4 DNA strands to CSR 2.0: value creation, good governance, societal contribution, and environmental integrity. These are not new things, but we do need to pull them together. Each of them has a slightly different goal. So economic development, institutional effectiveness, stakeholder orientation, and sustainable ecosystems. And of course, each of them has many indicators. I've just picked out a few that I believe are most important. It needs to be around the actual products and services, making sure that they are beneficial to society in terms of their life cycle impacts. It needs to be about inclusive business, so not only doing business and making profits, but who benefits from that wealth and how does it get distributed. And I've been interested, I was addressing the high-level group on CSR at the EU a few weeks ago, and the new Lisbon strategy for the EU now talks about growth, but the growth that they want is smart, sustainable, and inclusive growth. So I think the trend towards inclusiveness and sustainability is being bedded down across the world now. Transparency, of course, ethical conduct, philanthropy, fair labor practices, and then moving towards renewables and zero waste production. Now, there are certain trends, I believe, that we're seeing that underscore this move to CSR 2.0, essentially a move from purely philanthropic to a more collaborative model, from purely risk-based to reward-based, purely image-driven to performance-driven, from specialized, sitting in individual departments, to more integrated within organizations, from global standardized to more diversified, but still holding on to the principles, from something that is essentially marginal to scalable, and a Western concept to a truly indigenous or global concept. And a number of things I think we may see changing. So the idea that we can always rely on premium products that are more ethical or more sustainable, I think has to go, because we'll never reach the scalability if it's always down to a few ethical consumers making that choice and usually having to pay more. So rather looking at more inclusive products, bottom of the pyramid, and scalability. From pure charitable projects more to social enterprise or social venture capital. From CSR indexes to ratings, and I'll need to say what I mean by that. We're now awash all over the world with all kinds of rankings of companies on CSR. But there's a problem with these rankings, which is, firstly, that sometimes they contradict each other. So I remember being in China and talking to the head of CSR for Bayer, large pharmaceutical and chemical company, and in the same week he got an award for one of the most responsible CSR companies, and for being the fourth most toxic company in the world. So, I mean, what do you do with that if you're a financial analyst or somebody trying to understand the impact of that company? The ratings, the indexes contradict themselves. Not only that, but they tend to rank the same old companies over and over again, just in a slightly different order. And so what about the tens of thousands or millions of companies? And so I think that we can learn a lesson from the credit rating agencies, although admittedly they were asleep for the last couple of years. But the approach of the rating agencies, which is to try and come up with ratings for companies that look at their integrated performance, and where a company starts to get an A+ or a B-, and where people can start to compare companies no matter how big or small they are. This idea of CSR departments, I think they will probably shrink. There will always be a need for specialists, but we have to build it into the incentive packages for your marketing department directors, for your financial directors, for your operations managers, and so on. The move towards choice editing, which is simply what Walmart is doing, is to say, take away the choice from the customers. Why offer a more ethical or a less ethical product? Why not just offer the ethical product? The idea of moving to the service economy, this has been around for a while, but instead of selling people products which then become a liability, rather have service agreements like Shaw Carpets where you take it back and you completely recycle it. Speeding up of reporting cycles, I've talked about the rise of social networks. And very importantly, I think the rise of performance standards as opposed to process standards. So ISO 14001 is a process standard because it allows companies to set their own targets, and theoretically a company could be the most polluting company in the world, could say we're going to improve our situation by 1% over the next 100 years, and theoretically they could get an ISO 14001 certificate. It's just the idea that if we leave it to companies to set their own targets and just to have a process of incremental improvement, we're never going to get to the scale and urgency that we need to solve some of the problems we face. Whereas a performance standard sets absolute performance. It's about labor, working conditions, about not working beyond a certain number of hours, about child labor, nobody above a certain age. It's about things like climate change, not going beyond certain, like 450 parts per million in the atmosphere. These translate into absolute requirements. So those that have been very awake may have noticed that the principles, to make it easy, spell out CSR 2.0, creativity, scalability, responsiveness, locality, and circularity. And for me, it is about bringing these two strands of DNA together. And so I prefer, when I say CSR now, what I really mean is corporate sustainability and responsibility. And in some ways, I like to think of sustainability as what we're trying to achieve. We want a sustainable society, one that continues. We want a sustainable planet, one that endures. So that's really about the vision, the challenge, the strategy, and goals. Whereas responsibility is literally about how we respond. It's about our actions, our management, our solutions in order to get us there. So in the end, what have we got to lose? I like this cartoon at a climate summit. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? And of course, that doesn't make any sense. And I do believe that CSR can be part of creating a better world. But I think we should stop fooling ourselves that a lot of what is currently called CSR is really part of the solution, when I think it is a mask behind which companies are enabled to carry on with business as usual and not fundamentally get to the heart of the problem, which is our consumption and production lifestyle. So let's adopt a new version. Let's go for CSR 2.0, call it what you like, but let's reinvent what we're doing in this space, and let's, in that way, make a real difference in the world. Thank you. Any questions?
Hello. You hear me? Okay. Hi. Interestingly, yesterday I read an article in The Last Economist about how NGOs should or should not collaborate with businesses. I don't know if you've seen that. It's quite interesting. It focused on some of the examples I think that you showed. how NGOs that collaborated with BP in particular are finding themselves in the spotlight. So you looked at it from the side of the business, let's say, point of view. But what about the broader society, NGOs, citizens' organizations? What does CSR2 mean from their point of view? Because, for example, Just Means that you showed is clearly an initiative that comes from the bottom. So perhaps you'd like to add something on that issue. Thank you.
Well, the first thing I'd say is I do believe a vibrant and active civil society has to be part of the solution, because it's, in a way, a counterbalancing force. And if we don't have it, if we really just leave companies to themselves in a fairly unregulated way, we see the kind of trouble that we get ourselves into. I think the way that it will happen with CSR 2.0 is that we'll need to have the full spectrum of types of CSR and sustainability NGOs. And so there have been some that have gone into collaboration with business and are now beginning to question that, because the businesses haven't fundamentally changed the business they're in. And so I think we need to retain that radical element of civil society that really keeps business under pressure and on their toes, and really questions whether their business model is truly sustainable. But at the same time, you know, if you're always only shouting from the sidelines, you're not part of the solutions. So we will need one type of NGO that works with the companies to actually implement some of the solutions, and perhaps works especially with the more progressive companies. I think there's always a dilemma about who do you work with. Do you sort of keep banging your head against the wall with the dinosaurs, or do you really identify those that are moving fast and are innovating and try to support them? And I think, if anything, the pendulum has shifted a little bit to working with those innovators. And then you've seen a few of the giants, like, say, a Walmart, surprising the world a few years ago. And then when they are ready, or a Marks and Spencer's, then, you know, work with them as much as you can, but keep them on their toes. So, yeah.
May I ask a question? How about CSR in a country that is in an economic crisis, like Greece? Do you have any comments?
Well, I think this comes down to how we define CSR, because if you say it's just about philanthropic activities, then actually I think generally in the financial crisis, what we've seen, those activities will suffer. All the budgets are being cut. But if we see it as being about genuinely making a sustainable society and getting to the heart of the problem, then I think there's a huge role to play. And a lot of it, for me, comes down to corporate governance and how we integrate corporate governance and CSR. Some of the most progressive areas where this is happening is in South Africa, where they put sustainability at the heart of the corporate governance code. So I think that helps. I think learning the lessons from countries that have avoided the crisis. So I was in Australia a couple of months ago, and they had their scare about 10 years ago, and so they completely reformed their banking industry, and as a result have hardly been affected by the financial crisis. So learning from those countries is important. And then it's really about saying, what are the priorities? Where are the major impacts? And when you're in an economic crisis, the best thing you can do is to get the economic situation working again. So don't work on peripheral things, but work on the heart of the problem. Now, I know it's very difficult. You mentioned Greece, but I was in Georgia a few months ago, not in the United States, in the Baltics, and I came away just feeling like there's no business case for CSR there. I mean, the government is got their own problems, and tends to be have problems with corruption. The consumers certainly aren't asking it. There aren't any big brands. There's no civil society that's pressuring. So it's very difficult in a situation like that. And in the capital city, Tbilisi, the unemployment rate was 80%. So that is that they're having a financial crisis there. And how do you talk about even CSR in that context? You have to go back to the basics and to say that it is about good economic activity which is inclusive and spreads to people. So get that right, you know, get the institutional corporate governance and financial institutions working again. everything else for the moment is sort of second priority.
A couple of observations. When Simon Zadek of Accountability came back from China just a couple of months ago, and this is to your point about you hope that the standardization wave has now almost ended. What he discovered in China was 10,000 standards being developed by Chinese government to export, not just exporting the products, but exporting the standards as well. So I don't think the standards game has ended. And then to the question, what do you do with CSR in a downturn? If you look at Japan and its history, it often invested into the downturns, and when the recovery came, it was far better positioned. My own personal belief is that those countries that abandon the good sides of CSR during a downturn actually disadvantage themselves when the recovery comes.
Mm. Thank you for that. I mean, having also just come from China, it's one of the real concerns is that what they've realized is that what the West wants is this formal CSR, this institutionalized, reporting and standards. So even since I was there last in 2008, I mean, reporting has skyrocketed in China because the government's realized, oh, that's what they want in the West. And so standards is the same kind of thing. Oh, so they want standards, we'll give them standards. And yet, I think all that does is takes them to where we've got to in the West, which is, more of the same, but probably at a bigger scale, not solving the fundamental problems. So it's a real concern. What I am in favor of, though, is more local context-specific standards. So some of the standards, if they're developing them for certain sectors in China, so long as they don't abandon international principles, I think that's a good thing. So. One more?
Hello, good morning. I'm very much interested in the relation of CSR and marketing. Today you see a lot that CSR dedicated organizations, they are the marketing, or they do marketing for their organization for CSR. Companies that have a CSR policy use the CSR policy as a marketing tool rather than an integrated philosophy, let's say. It's very much marketing related. Budgets often come from marketing for CSR.
Yeah.
How I mean, CSR 2.0 is marketing. Yeah. 2.0 is marketing.
Well, my view is, and I have to confess, my first discipline was marketing, although I sort of left it behind. I think companies that are using CSR purely as a marketing or a public relations vehicle just is an indication of how immature CSR is in their organization. But it's a necessary step because it does add a little bit to the business case. There is a reputational element to doing CSR and being recognized for that. But if they get stuck there and they don't then back it up with real change, as probably we've seen with BP actually, I mean 10 years ago they were at a marketing level, they were really seen as leading the pack, and now they've lost a lot of that credibility. So they have to then move beyond to a more integrated model and ultimately to a transformational kind of CSR, which I like to think of as a radical CSR in the sense that it must go to the root of the impacts that the company is having. So I never tell companies not to use the marketing, but to move beyond it. When I was with KPMG, I remember many companies getting into the reporting game, and it became, we have this English saying, it became the tail that wagged the dog. Because actually what they found is that once they'd put the report out, suddenly they had to change all kinds of things inside the company in order to back up what they were saying. So it is a necessary step, but it's fraught with danger if you do it wrong. I teach a course on this, and I show one graph where the expectations of companies have been going up on CSR, and the performance, the perceptions of the performance have been going down. So what seems to be happening is that the marketing, which is meant to be doing the company a favor, is increasing the gap between expectations and delivery. So that's quite dangerous.
Right, but would you see like marketing being important to CSR in general? I mean, if you are a company, you have a product or the company itself, you always try to position yourself as soon as you can as the leader in the market. And you use marketing to do that, and then you start to deliver actually. CSR, do you think it could benefit even being maturing as it is from this exposure by marketing?
Yes, I mean, the company can benefit from the reputational enhancement if it's backing it up with delivery. If it's not, then it backfires on them. You know, Warren Buffett said it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to lose it. And I think that's what happens. He also said on the financial crisis, it's only when the tide goes out that you realize who's been swimming without their clothes on, which I kind of think is happening in CSR, is a lot of companies that were only doing very superficial CSR have suddenly been exposed, whereas those that are doing something more fundamental haven't been. So yes, I think there's a role for marketing, but it needs to be carefully handled. The other thing I would say on marketing is we've got to remember that it's very culturally determined. Many of the countries I'm going to, even the faith or the religious traditions are not supporting the marketing approach. I mean, in Islamic countries, you know, it's not seen as good practice to brag about your good deeds to society, and yet that's what the West is asking for. So one of the concepts of CSR that we talk about now, or the academics talk about, is implicit versus explicit CSR. And a lot of what we talk about as CSR in conferences like this is explicit CSR. It's what we see on the outside. It's the reports and the codes and the management systems. But there are many countries and many companies that are doing implicit CSR. Their practices are good, they're integrated, but they're just not telling the world about them. And we need to recognize that and respect that also.